Okay.
Got it. All right. So,
Hey, all right.
was
So,
Enigma of Life earlier. Beautiful
oh,
playing, beautiful sound. So
oh
tell me
wow.
what was on that one.
Oh man. I don't know. It was that song was kind of like I was writing stuff during that pandemic. It was one of those days where I just did, felt gloomy and kind of, what is life all about? Kind of wondering about those big philosophical questions. And it was one of those songs that came to me very easily, very fast. Usually, you know how it is. Like some songs come to you in 10 minutes, and then other songs take like years.
Yeah, yeah. It is. It's strange that way, but yeah. But it's a beautiful song, and so you nailed it. Whatever that feeling was, you definitely nailed it.
Wow.
Guitar, really beautiful. Is that software stuff, or did you mic up an amp?
No, actually, I was actually gonna ask you about that for your album because I read that you used plugins completely for the new one for Elephants of Mars, right?
One plugin.
Oh, one, not
That,
even a lot, just one.
yeah, yeah, quite surprising. Yeah, I mean, as you can see behind me, I had my usual amount of stuff that I play through every day. I'm really an old school player when it comes to amps. I like keeping the distance between the guitar and the amp as short as possible. I like pedals on the ground and 100-watt heads turned up really loud. That's kind of like the way I like it. But as you know, recording is something else entirely. It's got nothing to do with what
Yeah,
we do
man.
on. And so I started out thinking, well, I'm going to do what I always do, which is I'll record with an amp and I'll record DI simultaneously, and I'll see what sounds best once we get to the rest of the band on there. And usually I'm in a studio. We got 10 days. The whole band's there. We kind of figure things out real fast. We record a lot of stuff live. This time around, everything was remote. We spent almost a year because everyone was moving around. No one was in the same city. And so I never knew what the final mix was going to sound like. So I started to generate tracks that were options. But
Mhm.
song by song, the Sansamp plugin was the one that sounded most like me and sounded like I was as close to the speakers as possible. It was the strangest thing because, intellectually we all thought, well, that can't be right because that plugin's like from the 90s and, it's not modeling. It's not anything. It's just like a funky plugin. And I love the Sansamp rack unit. I've used that,
Okay.
on and off over years. But none of us could deny it. And we didn't really sort of grasp it until we mixed the last song. And I was having a discussion with Eric, my producer, and we said, you know what? We use that Sansamp track on every song, every single song, every clean guitar, every crunchy guitar, every overly distorted guitar, stuff with pedals in front of it. That was the one that when you A-B'd them against, the PV, the Marshall, whatever,
Kind of better.
uh, it just sounded better. It sounded, here's the weird thing, and you would know this because you know this experience like I do. You're in the music room, you're standing next to your amp, you get a great tone and you go, this is great. This is exactly what I want. The engineers put microphones in it, you record, you go into the control room and you go, what happened?
Yeah.
Like, what do you do to my sound? Come out here. You know, then that whole discussion, well, microphone is not the same as your ears. And, the compromise that goes on for a guitar player, for just about everybody actually in the band, the compromise is insane.
Yeah.
And the only thing that gets better are vocals, because the microphone has a way of getting you so close to somebody's voice that you wouldn't normally be that close to somebody screaming.
Right.
So, this is a thing that always bothered me. And when I found myself alone in a studio recording, I thought, I bet, even though this is the worst scenario that we're all under, a pandemic and being separated from each other, I'm going to figure out like if there's some advantage here. And there were a few. Number one was, being alone was great because you were less shy to try the craziest things, and you wouldn't have
And
to
the
worry.
clock is not ticking in the studio.
It's not costing you anything. No one's making fun of you when you make stupid mistakes. Just everything just sort of gets really relaxed. But that whole thing about I'm not going to compromise this time because I've got to get this solo done before 2 p.m. And move on. So, if that's the sound the engineer gets, then that's what I got. I'm not going to do that time. So that allowed that experimentation to continue. And that's when once you slow down, you start to notice things. And that's what I noticed was the biggest thing about it, was that every little inflection I did on the guitar was being picked up by Sansamp, and it was never homogenized to make me sound like typical 80s guitar player, or typical 90s guitar player, whatever. No matter what pedal I plugged in, it always brought more of me out, whereas the amps kind of made me sound 20% like, dude with a Marshall,
Right.
dude TV, and less like Joe, and that was that's a kind of a weird thing to.
So funny to hear you talking about that stuff, man. Sorry to interrupt you, because it's so funny to hear you talk about that. Like, because for me, like, I mean, I've been a lifelong fan of yours, so ever since I can remember picking up the electric guitar. So one of the things was always like, how does he get that tone? What is it? Like, that was, and like in the 90s, like pre-internet, I didn't know, like we had to see photos of guitar players to figure out, oh, this is what he plays. I remember that album you put out, Time Machine, and I think that was your first live thing you put out, or it was a compilation.
Second. Yeah, it was about second. Yeah, but it was big. Yeah, double record.
And I remember looking through the booklet. I'm like, I have to see what Joe Satriani is using, man. Like, I hadn't seen some stuff very clearly. Maybe in some interview you talked about stuff, but then I wanted to see photos, and I remember it was like I'm trying to see the pedals, if there was like some photo of you with your floor pedal board. And I remember I was seeing like that Boss Super Overdrive.
Oh, it was DS1, yeah.
Right.
I think
I was wondering, is that the one that does the trick? That's how it makes you sound like Joe. But I mean, years later, I realized that, yeah, it's your tone is in your fingers, in your hands. And like you said, the amp has the character that's gonna, like I said, maybe 20% of it is gonna reflect on how you play and how you sound, but ultimately it's your hands, right?
Yeah, the ability of your gear to inspire you is a factor, a huge factor. You can imagine, and I'm sure this has happened to you, where you go to a concert to see one of your favorite musicians play, and they're not having a good night, because of something,
Right.
Their instrument, their monitors, their amp, whatever. And you can tell right away, well, this person, man or woman, is not giving 100%. And it's all because of some stupid little thing that just didn't go right. And we all know things go wrong every night at a show. But, I think that when everything's going right and you have a choice of what's going to, let's say, produce gain for your solo or for your melody or something like that, you're really reacting to the feedback you get from your gear. That tactile response. Do you want punch, or you're trying to get the amp to remove some of that punch so that you can play more legato, or
right.
Or you don't want to jump out of the mix so much. You want to kind of sit back.
Yeah.
These are things so important. And what I noticed, the weirdest thing about the DS1 was that I was doing something I'd never done before, which was to play instrumentals and to record instrumentals. I had no experience at it, really. And when I started to do that first tour in January of '88, I'd never been the guy leading an instrumental rock band. I was always a guy playing behind a singer, and I had no idea what to do. And I had a couple of pedals and a Marshall 100-watt half stack, and I was trying to figure out, how am I really going to do this? Like, how can I present the melody so that it's as big as a guy singing,
Right.
In a typical rock band. And I was trying to see the difference between what a guitar player uses when he's the lead guitar player in a band and he gets 16 bars to go crazy.
Yeah.
That's an entirely different rig. And you know this. It's an entirely different gig, job, whatever. You can be nasty if that's your personality in the band. You can be too loud, too nasty. In 16 bars, the effect is over and you go back to playing rhythm. You know?
Right.
But if you're playing 2 hours of nothing but melodies and solos in front of people, you can't do that. You just can't. You need some other gear. And I thought, well, how am I going to do that? And how can I affordably put that together so that I can play 6-7 shows a week, get it all on a bus with the band and the crew and drive to the next place. That's how everybody starts out, you know, if you're lucky enough to have all those gigs lined up. And so the idea of economy and also getting the proper tone and the tactile response was extremely important. So I had to look at the 3 elements, which is the guitar. And luckily the Ibanez guitars are really working for me. And then I thought, okay, I got to figure out some pedals. And then what makes the actual sound get out into the audience, you know? I spent years playing Marshall half stacks. I was convinced that was the only way to go because you could always get louder, you know.
Yeah.
You will never be drowned out. That volume just keeps turning up and gets louder and louder. And I love the 4 speakers. The array of 4 speakers is less punchy, but it spreads it out. And I realized I need the spread, you know, that's in order to be not annoying. And if I'm in a power trio, which we were at the time, Stuart Hamm and Jonathan Mooger, we all needed to be sort of wide sounding to make up for the lack of rhythm and, you know, keyboards and rhythm guitars.
Has your rig changed much since those days? Like the philosophy of the rig?
We as guitar players really did not have amps that had all the gain in the world back then.
Actually, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
We had kind of, you know, the 800 was probably the best, punchiest sounding Marshall, but it didn't go to 10. You know what I mean? It kind of only went to
people would modify them back in the day to have more gain, right? They would go to text to modify them.
And they'd get overgained, you know. So I had a couple of those. I had plexis that, let's say on the Surfing with the Alien album, they were right next to tracks that had either a early Chandler tube driver or a DS1. So a song like Satch Boogie starts with my guitar into a Chandler tube driver, into a plexi, a half stack, and that was modified a little bit and not too loud. And then when the solo comes in, all the tracks are actually DS1, the 2 rhythm guitar tracks and the main solo. The gain level jumps up.
Right.
The microphone goes from a shotgun mic to a close mic, and suddenly that guitar solo gets right in your face. And we needed that extra gain. So, but the DS1, I have to make this point for anyone who wants to play melodies, is that, you know, that you plug into a twin reverb and you turn it up to 10. That's a great sound, but that is going to kill people who are right in line with it.
Yeah.
You know, it's this, you know. So I found that, well, I can't do that. I can't. That's not the way I'm going to be playing melodies if I want them to soar. You know, I want the melodies to, you know, develop and you know, blossom. So I needed something that would immediately bring the dynamic level down, and that I found was the DS1. Even though the DS1 doesn't really go to 10, you know, 10 being most gain, you know, it's always stuck at 8.5. You're always looking for that one other number. Right. Definitely doesn't go to 11. So, and it doesn't like to be put with any other amp. So what I eventually found was that if I could find a Marshall that got just barely crunchy, just barely, and I put this DS1 in front of it, the Marshall's input would take care of a bit of fuzz that's at the top of the pedal.
Which Marshall did you plug it into? Which model?
Anything that I could rent, that I could find. I had the Mark II leads, that came out in the late 80s. Late 70s. Yeah. I tried some Jubilees. They were really hard to work with. I had plexis. Eventually, in the early 90s, when the 6100 came out, that was the perfect pairing of the DS1 into the clean channel, set at about 6. The input just started to break up in a way that it would not pass the high-end sizzle from the pedal and add just enough oomph, to push it. And the 6100 has a smaller transformer than all the other 100-watt Marshall heads. It's a really weird animal. It's got a bunch of terrible MIDI stuff in there. I never used any of it. I just went right to the clean channel. The effects loop was really a plus, but I really like running everything into the front. Right. And what I found with that is, although it had a bit of a boxy sound, it wasn't like an 800 with a tube screamer in front of it. It wasn't like a boogie amp that had quite a lot of gain to it, and it certainly wasn't like an old school, Hendrix turn it all the way up kind of thing with a fuzz face. The DS1 had this thing that I liked I think it's because of when I grew up playing, which is, I grew up in a time when there was a transition between germanium fuzz and solid state distortion pedals. And I always thought, well, I love this and I love that, but I don't love either of them entirely.
Right.
So if the two of them could come together. And that's what I heard with the DS1. I found that I could plug it into a JC120 and turn that thing up, mic it up with a certain mic, limit it with an LA2A or 1176 in the studio, and I can imitate a big amp at the Royal Albert Hall. You just never know the difference. And I thought, well, this is really great, because tactile, the DS1 took a lot of the transient response out of my signal, which allowed me to play more aggressively. This was the other thing. Long explanation ever, but the other thing about guitar playing is that sometimes what you want for rhythm guitar and for just doing that 8-bar solo is you want lots of transient stuff to come out. You want to be bold and loud and everything to chop out. Again, you're playing 2 hours of melodies and solos in front of an audience. It's a bit fatiguing. So you need something that's a bit softer. And I noticed that the pedal, although it was a little, $40 pedal, which was kind of a sin, right? In guitar world, to plug your guitar into that. Once you really big rig, something else happened. And you just had to play, and it's really subtleties. I mean, you had to dime the pedal, but just be very subtle with the amp, and use certain kinds of speakers that wouldn't be too revealing, about the sizzle coming from the little box. And you could really get a beautiful sound. And when you turned your volume down, it was dead quiet. No need for noise gates, which is great.
Yeah, but when you turn it up, it did get a bit noisy, I think. That's the only thing that annoyed me about the DS1. I thought it was almost had this nice compression to it. It gave you that kind of like excellent lead tone that everything, the playability was like taking you to other level. But I thought it was kind of noisy always, but maybe I took the gain too high. I didn't know much about it. But you ran it also with noise, some kind of like noise compressor or a noise suppressor?
No, I never used one with that. No, because the amps were clean. That's the thing. When I turned off that DS1, you heard a very plain guitar sound. Right. It was as pretty as like going into a clean Fender Deluxe Reverb. It was a bit plain sounding, kind of,
Somehow I thought you would always boost it, like you would use it over the high gain sound, but that's what I thought. No, right?
No, never did that. No, it's funny. Steve, my friend Steve I, he does that a lot. He went for a more maybe like 7.5 on a scale of 1 to 10 as far as gain goes for his basic sound. And then he would use an overdrive or a DS1 to get him into solo land. Mm-hmm. So my approach was totally different, which is put the DS1 on 10, put the volume up on 10, keep the tone at about 9 o'clock, which is, 3/4 off basically. And I could talk to you about that. I know everything about the pot that does that, and how mysterious it is. But then use the amp really loud and clean. So all the power actually comes from the amp not being distorted.
Wow.
And that's why it's so quiet. So like when we were doing stuff like, if you watch the Live in San Francisco DVD,
yeah,
there's lots of improvising. The G3, the first G3 I did, lots of improvising right at the top of the show, subtle playing. That's the DS1 allowing me to back off the volume control and get a beautiful clean sound with no noise and no fear of noise gate, chopping me off.
Wow.
That part, I really love that part of it. And when I was working with Santiago Alvarez at Marshall to do my JVM, that was one of the things that I had to, tell him what I was looking for. I said, believe it or not, I want something that's in between that, the master volume sound all the way up and the old germanium fuzz, because these are the things that allow me to be expressive with melodies, have enough gain for legato, have enough attack, but not too much attack for the more aggressive styles of playing. And it's difficult. I mean, you really, in some ways, as you know, nothing sounds like a Telecaster into a twin reverb except a Telecaster and a twin reverb. So if that's what you got to get. But when you have a gig where you got to cover a lot of ground, you do have to think, okay, I've got to trade this for that and see what I can get. But so from that attitude and those realizations, we were able to create something quite unique that kind of frees me up. So ever since the second Chickenfoot tour, actually, come to think of it, after the first half of the first Chickenfoot tour, I went totally non-distortion box, and I just used the JVMs for all distortion, and that really did help quite a bit. It just gave me a more natural sound.
Okay, and that's your rig, like more like nowadays.
Yes, yeah. Ever since then, so it's been quite a while since, well, I guess that was 2009 or something like that. It has been just that, yeah, and it's been so reliable. And the amp itself is, it's got 12 different sounds. When you add up the modes and the 4 channels, you can get a lot of things going, and it's got a clean channel that kind of mimics the 6100 in one of its modes. So if I ever did want to go back to the DS1 or the saturator pedal, I could easily do that.
Right.
But it's when you do all the comparisons back and forth, it's almost like what you see back there when I play the EVH, the Soldano, and then the JVM. What happens is that I notice the EVH is tuned so much for late Eddie, what he was trying to achieve. And you can only play his stuff if you've got an amp that does that, and then you move to the Soldano, and it's a different kind of a sound. It's really mid-range forward. It's not really very big, beautiful amp. It's got great sounds made perfectly, You move to JVM and suddenly the sound is super wide. And so it's not as focused as like the EVH, but for me, the EVH would never work in a solo gig because it's too pointy.
That's a very tight sounding amp. I mean, it's probably more suitable for, that's why a lot of the metal bands, a lot of the metal guys, they use those because of that kind of tone, like really aggressive, tight. It's like for that one thing. It's a great studio amp too. But two different beasts, comparing to your Marshall. Yeah.
It's amazing. It really is. So, to tie it into your original question, I went through all of that, and to land up, with the Sansan plugin was really funny. Because what the plugin did was it eliminated all those things that we just talked about. And it gave me ultimate control after my performance to take something I played and change it to crystal clear or to overly distorted to super bright to super dark to incredibly bassy to no. I could just sit there and, make a million different versions of something that I played, and marry it with what Brian Beller did on bass, what Ray did on keyboards, what Kenny was doing on the drums, and that allowed the album to eventually become as big and broad sounding. Was that flexibility that we all had.
Was it like the first time you ever used plugins on recordings?
No, no. The very first time I used SansAmp would have been Crystal Planet album.
Crystal Planet.
I think we were up at the site here in Northern California, and we were fooling around with a song, and we were just kind of looking for different ideas. And the engineer, Mike Fraser, I think was having lunch or something. So I was just sitting down with Eric with his editing rig, and he said, "Oh, well, let's just plug in here. We'll just fool around with some ideas." And I played something, and it was like a 57 Strat, like right into Pro Tools with the SansAmp. And like, we instantly had this solo that sounded really amazing. And I was shocked because I thought, that sounds like a $40,000, Fender Super Twin, and like, but it's this little thing, in your computer. So of course, when we brought it into the studio, we were like, wow, like, we had the whole band, and we had all the guitar amps recorded for the rhythm guitars and the melodies. Then all of a sudden the solo comes and it just kind of jumps right out at you. And I thought, this is what's so amazing about this unit, this effect, is that it has a way of just pushing everybody aside.
Yeah.
And say, listen to me, and I thought, wow, it's like, that's pretty amazing. So I would say maybe, one or two songs per album ever since '98 would have one track, that had either the SansAmp plugin or this. I mean, this thing here, I don't know if you've ever seen one of these.
Yes, I know these. Yeah.
These are, believe it or not, they're a little bit noisier than the plugin, but they sound great. It's a really interesting technology. I don't know how to explain it, other than I know that I have an affinity for solid state circuits, that I feel something that I like when I'm playing melodies and solos that's very immediate. It's not the amp sag. When I hear stuff back that I've played with a lot of sag, like through a really old Fender channel, I appreciate what it sounds like. But while I'm doing it, I don't like it. The weirdest. I mean, I've done records where I brought 50 vintage amps, all tweeds, all, super cool amps, and I play through them and I hate it. As I'm playing it, I'm going, oh, this is terrible. It's muddy. It's mushy. It's like tagging, I hit a note, milliseconds later, it finally comes out of the speaker, that kind of thing. Yeah. But then once mixed, I sit back and I go, wow, that has a quality to it.
Yeah.
And as long as you're not physically involved in playing it, you can enjoy it. So that's something guitar players have to get used to, I think, is there's a difference between playing and listening.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, you're right. It's something we have to remind ourselves sometimes. And I mean, man, like plugins nowadays, they come a long way, and nowadays I remember like it used to feel like a few years ago, I would play through some plugins and it would feel kind of plastic, but nowadays it almost feels like some of these companies, they make stuff that's incredible. Like it almost feels like you're playing through a real amp. You know what I mean? Like it's almost there now.
It's almost
amateur there, like to the millisecond, whatever. It's just the response, it blows my mind how they do that nowadays. I mean, on my last album, I used everything was also plugins, everything.
So, and what was your suite? Did you Neural or Amplitude?
I used, actually, believe it or not, and I have like the IK multimedia stuff. It was actually a mix of things, but my main tone came from an STL Tones, and it was like a free plugin. It was this amp called the Emissary. I just downloaded this free amp, and it ended up being the main lead tone on the album.
That's great. That's great.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, man. I mean, also I wanted to ask you a little bit. I mean, we talked a lot about gear and stuff, but a little bit about the new album, which I love. Congratulations, man. Elephants of Mars.
Thank you.
Concept album, right?
Well, it's funny. I didn't think of it when I started it. The concepts were kind of without story. I literally thought, I'm done with classic rock oriented albums. That was the first thing, as
Right.
much as possible. I mean, you know, I am what I am, I suppose. But the last two records, I really went out of my way to record old school. I went to, you know, old school style recording studios. I hired guys that were around my age group, and we went in and we recorded like you would normally do, you know, 40 years ago.
Right.
And so, and that was fun. And I had songs that kind of fit with that vibe. But once we were really sort of grasping what the scene, you know, having to make an album, not being able to tour, shape-shifting, and trying to brainstorm what to do next, I thought, well, I definitely have to change, you know, my attitude and stop trying to capture something I missed, because I was really too young for the classic rock era, and I just missed it, you know, by a couple of years. And so albums like The Extremist, the 95 eponymous release, and the last two were really kind of like my little notes to that era, you know,
Right.
wanting to sort of recreate it. But I thought, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. And there's no way to do that because I'm stuck at home. And I'm going to these are my themes: write better, arrange better, play better, get more interesting guitar sounds, and put together a team that's willing to do something unique. And those were the only themes. The title track came quite late in the production of the album, but once I had come up with that sound and that song and wrote a story behind it and told the band, it seemed to galvanize everybody, and everybody suddenly knew what the rest of the album could be, and how they could approach it, and
Right.
everyone relax and get crazier and create something that was basically just more creative than your typical guitar album.
I mean,
let's say
it's
by someone.
it's a very different album for a Joe Satriani album, you know, because I know most of your work. I'm familiar with most of your work throughout your career. And I mean, I heard elements that, of course, you touched upon it, you know, the previous albums and phases, but it was like, I don't know, not to that extent, maybe as before, like jazz fusion stuff, prog, psychedelic stuff, like you expanded more and more on those kind of things. Am I right? I don't know. That's what I felt listening to the album.
Definitely. No, I think, yeah, there's definitely, in some ways, there's more aggressive playing. And then in some ways, stuff like East 104th Street is totally out of from the last number of records. And this, I think, was maybe the theme that no one said, you know, which was, let's just not have any barriers when it comes to composition or style of playing. So, you know, that particular song, East 104th Street, I created a demo with the guitar part that you hear on there. It was just a live performance over a set of loops. The loops, though, one was straight and one was swinging. It seriously sounded messed up, like I had screwed up the demo or something. But to everybody, this is a cool thing. I want you to listen to it and listen to how my live guitar plays off the straight hip hop beat and the really swinging jazz beat. And I kind of go back and forth. So, of course, you know, Brian's like, well, which part does the bass play to? Am I swinging or am I straight?
Right.
And I said, what's going to get us to some new level here? Eventually, the burden fell on Kenny to figure out how one human drummer was going to play with the audience and go back and forth between straight and swinging.
Like a mix of the two beats, kind of.
Yeah, and it's a funny feel, but what I felt was that a composition like that doesn't have verses and choruses and bridges is going to have something else that makes you feel interested to see how the whole thing plays out. And that was the key. That was the little magic element, which is we're going straight, we're swinging, we're straight, we're swinging, and we just kind of play with that as the song goes along. And then you can kind of sit back and just enjoy the ride. And so Kenny really had to come up with a performance that guided the band, that sounded like we were playing with him, even though he was one of the, maybe third person on there. I think the last person to play on there was Ray. After he finally heard what Brian and Kenny and I had done, he figured out a way to just sort of groove without sticking out too much.
Right.